Hi, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for this first session of the new series on Palestine, organized by الشرق Diwan, الشرق Youth specifically. And we're very, very excited to have our first two speakers for this session. Amazing speakers, and I'm really excited and looking forward to the discussion we're going to have today. My name is Hisham Yaza. I'm the editor of Ceasefire magazine and also a writer and editor. I'm going to be moderating the discussion, but I'd like at the outset to say that we look forward to questions from all our attendees and everyone who's on this call for people to send in their questions, because this will be the basis for the discussion. And I'm going to just explain very briefly the format for the session. We're going to have very briefly at the, I'm going to start with some house sort of rules and some specifics about the session, the series in general. And then we're going to get started with a few questions that I'll be moderating, and then we'll open it up for a general Q&A with everyone. So we expect the session to last about an hour 15 minutes. And as I said, this is the first of a special series called On Palestine. This is the first session, and the theme will be, the present moment. It's the case for Palestine, reflections on the present moment. Tomorrow will be the second session with Professor Ilan Pape, and it's on the crisis of Zionism and from within Israel. And on Thursday, on the 15th, will be the third session with Professor Norman Finkelstein, which will be on the crisis of Zionism, but from an international/US perspective. And I'm going now to very briefly introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Mezna Qato. She is a historian at the University of Cambridge, historian of the modern Middle East, and in particular of migration, development, and social histories of Palestinian refugee and exiled communities. She is currently completing a book on the history of education for Palestinians, and her research and teaching interests center on histories of and theories of social, economic, and political transformation amongst refugee and stateless communities, the politics and practice of archives, and global microhistories of movements and collectivities in the Middle East. Our second speaker is Dr. Ramzy Baroud. He's a Palestinian-American journalist and the editor of the Palestine Chronicle. He is the author of 5 books. The latest of these is These Chains Will Be Broken, Palestinian Stories of Struggle and Defiance in Israeli Prisons, from Clarity Press. He's currently working together with on a new book with Professor Ilan Pape called Our Vision for Liberation, Engaged Palestinian Leaders and Intellectuals Speak Out. And this will be coming out in November, I believe, and we will touch upon this book in the discussion today, as well as in tomorrow's discussion with Professor Pape. So before we start, I'd like to just remind all our attendees that this session is recorded. And as I said, we welcome your questions. So please send in your questions in the chat question sort of area, and we will make sure to take them, put them to the speakers. To begin with, I'd like to just start by asking you both, maybe starting with Mezna, answering the question, which is how should we think of the present moment? We've had, an extremely, in my view, unprecedented reaction to the events that happened in May. The 11 days in which we saw completely, a really remarkable set of events, both within Palestine and internationally. We saw a remarkable show of Palestinian unity, both within the occupied, West Bank and Gaza, as well as in the 1948 territories, in Israel itself. And we saw also a very significant global reaction that we had not seen in a number of years. So I'd like to ask you if you can tell us what you think, whether this is a pivotal turning point in the history of the area of the Palestinian struggle for liberation, and what your thoughts are in terms of what it means and how we should think about it. So maybe starting with Mezna.
Thank you so much, Hisham, and thank you everyone and the Sharq for inviting me to be with you all. I'm really looking forward to the conversation with you, Ramzy, and with everyone else as well. So what is this moment? As a historian, I'm quite hesitant to sort of make too broad and too strong and too of an assessment of what we've seen. And I think that all of those elements that you've described, unity, remarkable solidarity, violence, mass mobilization, we're all there. I think what's important to think about a little bit is how to read this in terms of scale within broad, longer Palestinian history, and how to think about some of the structural elements that become visible and then invisible, but are always there, both in terms of colonial violence and colonial capture, but also in terms of resistance. So there's a structure to the resistance, and part of what we're seeing is kind of a visibility to it that we haven't had for a very long time, but also we're also watching as it recedes in the news headlines as well. I think it's important to think about structure. I think it's important to think about visibility and its politics, and what we don't see and then what we do see. But I also think what's really also important that's happening is not just unity, but disunity, a very productive internal Palestinian intergenerational realignment, or a greater and stronger articulation of vision and of internal criticism that hasn't happened in quite a long time under these kinds of conditions. And I think that that's been a really important element of what we're seeing here. So just to remind everybody, before May, the biggest headlines coming from Palestine were about elections. Who talks about elections now? And what does it mean to think about these elections, these questions of democracy, et cetera? So I'd love to also talk about not just the relationship of Palestinians or the kind of the relationship of Palestinians to Israelis or the conflict, but also about, when we think about Palestinian history, to also think internally in terms of Palestinian internal social and political structures, and the relationship of Palestinians as well to the Arab world and what has and hasn't changed in the last month, 2 months, year, 10, 20, 30. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much, Mezna. That's already so much food for thought. And yes, I think the theme of unity / disunity, is a very powerful sort of lens through which to look at the current events, and through which to think through the step forward. I'd like to ask Ramzy now to share with us his thoughts on what the present moment means and how we should think about it.
Thank you very much, Hisham. Also, thank you to Sharq Diwan, Sharq Youth specifically, and also to Professor Mezna as well for her input and for all of her contributions and excellent scholarship. And I'll be definitely looking forward to her upcoming book on Palestinian education, or the history of Palestinian education. I think since what I call the Palestinian Revolt of May 2021, and I've been kind of trying to push this this title for quite some time now. I'm really hoping that it's going to catch on eventually. And I have my reasons of why I think it's a Palestinian revolt in the popular sense, as in this is the first time that we have witnessed. And I think the only two comparisons that can actually have any form of legitimacy from a historical point of view, although from a different historical context, are the uprising and the strike of 1936 to 39, and the first Intifada of 1987. And I think each one of these events has its own historical specificity, but ultimately this one, in some strange way, is perhaps the most consequential of these events. 1936 was an attempt by a Palestinian political or body politic that was in formulation around a new sense of national identity to fight British colonialism and budding Zionist settler colonialism that were taking place actively or step by step in Palestine in the beginning of the 20th century. While the first Intifada of 1987, it was a generation that wanted to reassert the centrality of the Palestinian identity, the Palestinian national project that has been either hijacked by a corrupt and growingly irrelevant Palestinian leadership that was exiled uncomfortably so in Tunisia at the time, and of course of a settler colonial project that is growing unhinged and emboldened in the occupied West Bank and Gaza at the time. The 1987 Intifada was quite inspiring in the sense that it created a generation that remained relevant until this day. And many of the leaders of the Palestinian movements, national movements, factions, parties, intellectual movement in Palestine today actually traces its roots to the 1987 Intifada or uprising. And the reason I'm saying that, and it's an argument I made in the past, that intifadas do not liberate nations, but rather uprisings liberate a people, liberate discourses, create new discourses. So my hope, and still the jury is somewhat out on this, is that the May revolt is going to be the moment of liberation, the beginning of this new movement that is going to lead the Palestinian national struggles for years, perhaps decades to come, and will be able to trace its origins to that specific moment in history, and that is the May 21 revolt. That's important in the sense that this revolt has done more than having Palestinian communities rise in solidarity with one another, whether in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan and so forth, with Gaza and Gaza back and the West Bank and Gaza and Sheikh Jarrah and East Jerusalem. But the discourse, the accompanying discourse, in my opinion, that's even far more important, because Palestinian solidarity has always manifested itself in one way or the other. But what really matters is the discourse that accompanied this moment. And it's a discourse that is somewhat liberated from the narrow factional allegiances and language into something much bigger. It's very clear in my mind that Palestinians have said and made it very clear that we are ready to move into that new stage of our resistance. What that stage is going to look like, we're not sure, but we are getting some promising signs that it's a generation that wants to move beyond the Palestinian Authority, wants to move beyond the whole Hamas-Fatah clash that's been going on and occupying the energies and the political spaces in Palestine for, frankly, decades, and wants to move and redefine the nature of the new struggle. Now, what will that new struggle be? Is it a struggle for a one-state coexistence in which the enemy is apartheid and racism? Or are we going to go back to the old language of a two-state? Where are we going to be? What is going to be the direction of this movement? It's too early to speak about this, simply because that generation is still in the process of formulating and discovering its energies and building its networks. And one last thing I want to say is that after the murder of Nizar Banat, the human rights activists in the West Bank at the hands of the goons of the Palestinian authorities, who are trained quite well, obviously, in torture and repression by the United States CIA, the Jordan, other countries in the region, and have done really quite a good job in suppressing Palestinians for so many years. That kind of internal, kind of localized intifada that is happening in the West Bank as we speak is finally linking the repression by the Palestinian Authority with the larger ailment of the Palestinian people. And that's one problem we've had for such a long time, is that we always spoke of the Palestinian Authority, at least locally within Palestine itself, as if it's just another corrupt Arab regime, and the Israeli occupation as if it's a different entity. They are one and the same entity, and the Palestinians in Palestine itself are now articulating that with such clarity. And that's another one of many promising signs that indeed the future could belong to that new generation that is ready now to move beyond Mahmoud Abbas and such.
Thank you so much, Ramzy. Mezna, would you like to come back on that? Is this something that you, I mean, especially on this theme of unity and how we should perceive the current sort of, as Ramzy calls it, the emergence of the body politique. If you can share your thoughts on what Ramzy has just said.
Yeah, I share quite a lot of what Ramzy is proposing, and although I guess I don't want to be a Debbie Downer or anything, but I do wonder if we can historically conclude that this is a revolt as yet. I don't think it has the mass element of 36, nor of 87, nor really of 2001. I think that there are elements of Palestinian society. And in fact, what's interesting is the class elements of this revolt, rather than the kind of broad sweep that would regard it as a mass revolt. But the elements that revolted this time are actually quite important. They're not just young. They're young, poor, disaffected, unattached politically, generally. And the reason I say this is I think that reflects itself in the discursive revolt that I think Ramzy is describing, which is an actual refusal of a kind of party-attached dogma and rhetoric. And I think what's important here is that, and we can talk about it a little later, but I think also what is important here is what these young people are refusing to do, which is to limit and narrow their imaginary of their future or collapse it into a conversation again and again and again to a one state versus two state language. There is a refusal of that too, that statism, that the obsession with one and two state that has dominated Palestinian politics in Palestine, as well as the larger Anglophone Palestinian political campaigning world, endless conferences, articles, whatever, conversations, it's being refused. The language is not now statist in its demands or its an imagination. It is, and it's also refusing. Part of this revolt is a refusal rather than a revolt, by which I mean that it doesn't, its demands have been the demands that have always existed, right? Which is decolonization, freedom, equality, whatever you may, say. But fundamental to the refusal too is a refusal of the limitation, and a refusal also of a kind of geographic and political and rhetorical sort of dichotomy. There are no 48ers, West Bankers, Gaza, Shatat. Everybody's Palestinian. Everybody has a role to play. It's not even in the language of like, that is in sometimes one state discourse as much as two state about the different kinds of needs of different communities. What was very clear here is young, poor Palestinians, especially men, in Yafa and Akka and Lid, face almost similar conditions to the Palestinians in Jerusalem, young Palestinian men in Jerusalem, poor Palestinian men in Jerusalem, as well as in the West Bank. The condition of Gaza is different, but elements of this class dynamic also exist there. So I think that it's also important to always think in terms of structures of Palestinian society, who ends up speaking and why, and who doesn't speak up and why, and how that reflects in the strategies of political mobilization in different places and in different parts of Palestine and in the diaspora, in the Shatat.
Thank you. That's a really fascinating answer, and I would be quite interested to see what Ramzy thinks about whether we can not call this a revolt yet. I mean, can I just ask Mezna very quickly, do you think it matters whether this is a mass revolt or not? Is this something that you think is a...
So of course, we don't want to kind of fall in the trap of I think, am I muted? No. I don't think we should kind of delve too much into this or get trapped into definitions. I mean, we've kind of learned our lessons throughout the so-called Arab Spring, and I still say so-called Arab Spring after all these years. I feel very uncomfortable with the term actually originally originating from an American think tank in description of the of the US invasion of Iraq and the potential democratic Arab Spring. And so we have to be very, very careful, because the etymology of war can have severe consequences on the perception of things. But I would say revolt in the sense that indeed there was a mass movement. I mean, I don't think we have seen this kind of numbers of people, let's be frank about this, going into the streets of the West Bank, of Gaza, of Jerusalem, of al-Fahim, and all in tandem, all sharing the same slogans, raising the same flags. You can't even distinguish with the various political philosophies and discourses between them anymore. They somehow became one and the same. But of course, we can discuss, what does make a revolt? Is it the continuity? Or is it something else? I mean, in my opinion, I don't think that revolt has ended as of yet, in the sense that it's manifesting itself, it's reflecting itself in different ways. The West Bank is now busy dealing with an element of that revolt, and that is its utterly corrupt, repressive leadership or so-called leadership in Ramallah. Gaza has its own local fight as well, and Palestinians in Palestine 48 also have to deal with their own local consequences or their own local fights. I mean, we know what's happening in the big debate in the Israeli Knesset parliament at the moment regarding the Marriage Unification Act, where they are basically trying to renew the ban on Palestinians marrying one another. So there are various manifestations of this resistance, and it expresses itself in so many different ways. I think the challenge is not whether it is a revolt or it's not, but where will this go? What is the final outcome of this? Does it have to be necessarily an outcome that is beneficial to the people for it to be a revolt or not? I think that is just something that historians and intellectuals will have to wait for quite some time in order for them to address. But I think what needs to be addressed right now is our role really as intellectuals. Number one, there's been a lot of discussions about one states and two states. And I think that the two-state element of that discussion is being relegated. You don't see lots of serious intellectual circles around Palestine made or composed largely from Palestinians who are still touting the two states. We are still talking about one state. And I completely agree with Mezna that this is really becoming kind of an intellectual exercise, and at times even an exercise in futility, rather. Because yes, we need to have a political vision. I don't think there is a revolution on earth that succeeded without actually having a political end, a political vision. Whether the Vietnamese or the Algerians or the South African anti-apartheid movement, every single one of these movements had a unified vision. But the question is, it seems to me that within the Palestinian case, this vision is being discussed at an elitist level by people who are not directly involved in the mechanics of the Palestinian reality. And Palestinians are fighting kind of almost like a different fight on the ground. I don't think many of the people who were engaged in the actual physical fight in Gaza, or battling with the settlers in the West Bank, or being victimized by the racist Jewish extremists in Israel, were intensely worried about whether it's a one state or two states. So I worry about that divide between us Palestinian intellectuals outside Palestine and the reality that transpiring itself in Palestine itself. So I think the solution for now is to actually pay attention to what Palestinians themselves are saying, to respect their wishes, to respect their whatever political horizons they have in mind, and try to engage, not speak down at them, but actually listen to them and engage with them. And ultimately, and this is really the best we can do at the moment, is to try to convey their voices through whatever platforms we can create outside of Palestine itself.
Thank you so much, Ramzy. This actually reminds me of so in the lead up to the series, we had lots of discussions, within Sharq about the sort of, what are the key ways in which to get into this topic. Is it really that important to go back to the history, for example? And I was wondering whether you could tell us what you think. So of course history matters, and history has to be at the starting point for any serious political engagement. But I know, for example, from what you've said recently, Ramzy, in your writings and in some of your interventions, that a lot of the debates, or what are considered to be debates, have been won, so to speak, by the Palestinian camp or the pro-Palestinian camp. And there's not really much point in going back and revisiting them or fighting them. And I was wondering whether both of you could talk about whether the Palestinian, is it important to frame the Palestinian case in terms of historical grievances? Is that still the primary lens through which we should make the case, or is there a case to be said for looking at it from, as many people are saying, as a human rights struggle, for example, or as something that's more to do with political or economic dimensions? So you can answer the question whichever way you interpret it, but I think the key sort of the crux of the question is, how important is history in terms of framing the case for Palestine? So maybe Mezna can go first.
I'm trying to think about how to approach a question like that, right? There could be the banal answer of the past is present. I don't think that's always necessarily the case. Although I did a special issue with dear comrades of mine and called it past is present. But I'm not sure sometimes, even as a historian, if all lessons can be galvanized from the past or taken up from the past. I think history is not a linear progress, like it doesn't move linearly. History is struggle by different people for different things, and has contingencies and has accidents and has, ways of not telling you in the present that, the only thing to learn is to keep fighting. But I think history and the study of history, what's interesting, we can talk also about, the conditions and the emergence of Palestinian studies through a largely historical lens that has now receded in its influence. Most Palestinian or Palestine studies people are not based in history, in the historical discipline. They are based in politics, anthropology, sociology, ethnic studies, etc. And they're, you know, I'm happy to talk about what that looks like. But you know, I wouldn't posit that that we should abandon ever any platform or any kind of strategy. There can be multiple ways we can make a case for Palestine. A historical case for Palestine, a moral and ethical and, you know, philosophical case for Palestine, a case for Palestine based upon international law, human rights, etc. These are all tactics and strategies of a national struggle, a struggle for self-determination against foreign occupation. But I think thinking about what Ramzy, to reference something Ramzy said earlier about the role of the Palestinian intellectual, and here I'll only think in terms of what I think the role of Palestinian historian is to also historicize the role of Palestinian intellectuals. I think there's a very big difference between the way Palestinian intellectuals in an earlier generation thought about their relationship to the kind of work that they do and their relationship to the people, and what we see now. By and large, the vast majority of Palestinian intellectuals and historians in earlier generations were part of the political movement. They were part of political parties. They developed journals and institutes that were politically committed. They were they were scholars, but they were revolutionary scholars. You have now a much more different professional managerial class. And it's not just in Palestine, in the case for Palestine. This is a sociological transformation of the role of the intellectual, and particularly the intellectual who regards themselves as part of the left or part of struggles of the left or struggles for justice or anti-colonialism and decolonization. That is quite individuated, right? So my job is to be the person. Well, who delegated you to be that, you know? To be the translator of the masses back and forth, you know? That kind of self-articulation is quite new in Palestinian politics. The robust collective endeavor of Palestinian intellectual production and historical production and archival production was often done anonymously. And it was done for a very particular purpose, which is to craft and think and debate and deliberate and challenge each other on these very questions of vision, on these questions of strategy and movements, on these questions of, you know, clear historical questions about, for example, endless articles about what is the class structure of Palestinian society, or the role of the relationship of feminism to nationalism, or what is a revolt and what is a revolution. We have an incredibly rich tradition of revolutionary thought that tends to be undercited, unfortunately, because it is not produced within the indices that are now regarded as how and in what venues an intellectual should or does write, and in what ways that intellectual should speak or translate between different communities and societies.
Thank you, Mr. Ramzy, history, how important is it as a lens through which to think about the Palestinian struggle?
Right, it's really difficult to add to what Mezna has said, because she really kind of placed this within quite a convincing academic paradigm, and it really does. I'm glad that at least this discussion is at least talking and mentioning I'm trying to kind of choose my words here very carefully. The role of the intellectual within the Palestinian struggle and without the Palestinian struggle, this individualized role in which intellectuals are all part of various universities, think tanks, NGOs, academic journals, and therefore they are beholden to almost different expectations, different standards, different rules, as opposed to those, say, the likes of Ghassan Kanafani, who was beholden to something entirely different, and that is the Palestinian national movement or socialist movement within the larger paradigm of the Palestinian national struggle. And he was killed fulfilling this role, the same way Najil Ali and others were killed, well, kind of, and assassinated rather, while trying to serve that specific role. And I think something has changed. And I'm trying to think what changed and when did that change actually begin taking place? And I would propose that possibly that change happened around the period of the Oslo Accords, when the Palestinian struggle in all of its manifestations shifted from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere, from the Middle East, Africa, South America, and elsewhere, to London, Madrid, Oslo, starting with Oslo, Washington, DC, and such. Now, even the anti-Oslo crowd are in some strange way also beholding to the trajectory of language and politics that Oslo and the Oslo culture imposed on us. So the fact that we're actually talking about the two-state solutions in the first place, the land for peace formula, the painful negotiations and the negotiations table and the painful compromises and the peace process and all of this, this is a discourse that never existed prior to the Palestinian engagement in Oslo. Yes, it existed within specific discourses, starting perhaps in the mid-1970s with Henry Kissinger, and which culminated to the Camp David Agreement, 1978, 79. But the Palestinians kind of remained somewhat outside that specific language and discourse. Only when we engaged in that, we all found ourselves gravitating towards that discourse. Even if you read my own articles, as much as I try to insist on using alternative language, liberation, resistance, not peace process and state building. What state building? In what stage of our revolution are we to even start talking about state building and democratic institutions of a country that is under military occupation, that is under a system of apartheid that is digging its heels even deeper and deeper? But here we are stuck within this discourse. So I think one of the most important jobs that the Palestinian intellectual can do, whether at an individual or institutional, or even, to be frank, factional or party level, is to push us away from that, so that we may, number one, reclaim our old language, perhaps modernize this language in a way that's more applicable to today's national struggles and communal struggles, but to also help us reclaim our understanding of our own history as well. Mezna alluded to how the role of the historian has changed, and perhaps it's time for us to kind of delve into historiography, of kind of the history of the historian as well. But I think that we also need to remember that our Palestinian history that is known in the West today is what I call history of negation, as in us as Palestinians being in this constant crusade of self-defense, that we are kind of like an apology of Palestinian history, that we are not terrorists and we are not as bad as the world think that we are, and we are willing to adhere to Western political sensibilities and engage with Western political discourses and such. And in the process of doing so, I worry that we are losing the centrality, the self, the Palestinian collective self in that version of history. If you ask an ordinary Palestinian in Gaza, in Ramallah, and I mean ordinary in the common definition of the term, not ordinary in the sense that they are anything but extraordinary people, ask them, what is your view of history? They don't necessarily have to bring in issues that might be of relevant to Western sensibilities. For example, in conferences, at times you find more Palestinians engaging with the subject of Palestinians are not anti-Semitic, or the Palestinian movement is not anti-Semitic, far more than them actually engaging in teaching people about their own history from their own unique, authentic, and original point of view. So I think our own history has been corrupted by the fact that we are overwhelmed by the power of the Zionist narrative, the power of the pro-Zionist mainstream corporate media narrative in the West, to the point that we have concocted this disconnected versions of history that serves at times more of an apology than anything else. And I think we really ought to consider this. And I know I've exceeded my time, just a few seconds just to say, perhaps by way of reconsidering our own historical narrative, maybe we should imagine Palestine not only not being a negation of some Zionist narrative as if we only existed when the Zionists wished for us to exist, but also forget entirely about the narrative of the factions. Palestine was not built around Hamas and Fatah, and Palestine is not directly the outcome of Hamas-Fatah unity or disunity, and of course other factors similar to these kind of factional squabbles. Maybe it is about someone different, and maybe that one that is different is the Palestinian individual as a representation of the community as a whole, of the Palestinian people as a whole. And this is why one of the reasons that I've changed my entire studies of academic study focusing on people's history as an attempt to explore this alternative option of retelling the history of Palestine from the viewpoint of ordinary people, because frankly, I find it the most anti-colonial and liberated of all versions of Palestinian histories.
Thank you so much, Ramzy. I think this leads me to essentially the same question, but maybe rephrasing it a little bit differently, which is, where is the site of the battle? If we're saying essentially there's a lot of the energy is going into debates that we shouldn't get into, or there's a lot of reactivity that, as you said, the politics of negation, that's always been framed around someone else's narrative, that I'm guessing presupposes that there's, you know, other sides of the battle or other directions in which the energies should be going. So especially with an audience, as we have today, of people who are either scholars or scholar activists, people who are very concerned with, you know, where to divert their energies and to channel their mobilization. You know, in your view, I mean, both of you, what are the key sites of the battle? In other words, you know, what are the battles that we should be choosing to take part in? And I guess by sort of implication, what are the battles we should be avoiding? So maybe Mezna can go first.
Sure. First, I want to say thank you, Ramzy. I really feel you on your frustration. I might articulate it a little differently and think about a few other things that maybe we can get to in the Q&A, but I just wanted to express how frustrated I also am about some of these similar dynamics. I think the most important thing is to figure out where one is. Are you in the Arab world? Are you in the broader Middle East? Where are you in the world? And then think about whatever state you are subjected to or live in or a citizen of or you pay taxes to, what that state is doing in Palestine. And then figure out what you're going to do about it. That is the most important solution conversation that anyone who is not Palestinian should be having. I am not interested in endless articles in the New York Times about this or that person becoming a one-stater. Then I am more interested in finding out what solutions any of these people in New York and DC have for transforming the relationship of the United States to the people of the Arab world and the broader Middle East. That is what we focus on. What we've always had to focus on. You know, pushing an anti-imperialist position wherever we may be. If you're Palestinian, you have a different set of concerns. And I think that's something that Ramzy tried to bring forward. I would say though, I mean, you know, I'll put it bluntly, for me, Palestine, you know, my homeland is Palestinians and less so Palestine. My homeland is to rebuild a relationship amongst Palestinians inside and outside Palestine, to build and craft a relationship between each other, political socialities that are democratic, that are representative, whatever they may be, inside or outside the structure of the PLO. That's undecided for me. Those are my primary concerns as a Palestinian. Not unity, but a politics of deliberation and listening to each other that has frayed so tragically in the last, I would say, 50 years or so. So, you know, that's, I think, where it has always been the most powerful. Palestine has always been this thorn in the side of any state that attempts to claim for itself the banner of liberalism, the banner of democracy, the banner of freedom and liberation or liberty. Their position vis-a-vis Palestine has often belied or made lie to that claim. So that is what we all need to be doing. If you're in the Arab world, I would say that you have there are multiple scales of what needs to be done. On the one scale, one must work for their own freedom and liberation. I tend to agree with those within the Palestinian broader political sphere who think that, you know, it's not possible for Palestinians to be free if those around them are still unfree. That freedom is collective. But second, you know, to push against the multiple levels of disinformation, propaganda against Palestinians in Palestine in order to push agendas of normalization and the demonization of Palestinians, both in their own country, in your own country, as well as in Palestine itself. And if you're in a country that has Palestinians in it, which is really every country in the world, to build relationships with people who, you know, are by and large, you know, are stateless in their national identity, or may have or may not have Palestinian passports. And I'm thinking here in particular of the Palestinians in Lebanon, of course, the Palestinians in Syria, the Palestinians of Iraq, of Libya, of Yemen, who both experience the horrors of their fellow countrymen, as well as the particular violences directed at them as Palestinians. So it's about finding, you know, it's about looking around you first, look locally, and you can do quite a lot from there.
Thank you, Mezna. Ramzy, what are the key sites of the battle?
It's very obvious that our battle is now going global. And I think it's going global because we must be doing something right. The fact that the Palestinian cause is now becoming part and parcel of many causes of struggle, people's struggles for equality, against racism, freedom, national liberation struggles. It shows that there is so much space that remains open for Palestine to be incorporated within a larger global struggle and solidarity paradigm. Now, this is important because we were told at one point that the traditional liberation, anti-colonial struggles days are over. It's behind us now. And it's too bad that Palestinians remain left behind, one of the very few nations that kind of remain hostage to this kind of traditional, classical, colonial paradigm, but it is what it is. In fact, this is why our leadership kind of became engaged in Madrid, Oslo, and so forth. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Americans are now the only hegemons. You have to be knocking at Washington's door day and night to make a case, to get your voice heard. Without Washington, there can be no change and no real tangible difference can be made. Well, that has been proven to be a complete farce. And of course, some of us have been saying it's a farce from the very, very beginning, and we were not being listened to. But this is what happened. Not only we got nothing at the end from the Americans, and the Europeans proved to be absolutely worthless in this, even if some European countries showed certain kind of sympathies that are different from the hardcore hawkish policies of Washington and London, but that's the reality. Not just that, the Trump administration, which decisions that have been admitted and accepted and embraced by the Biden administrations have changed the rules of the game altogether. And we're no longer talking even about the meager two states. We are discussing annexations, Jerusalem is off the table, that sort of thing. So we need to understand that the past is past, and we can't be rational people who actually have any degree of clarity as far as the future is concerned, can possibly go back to that old, tried, and failed methods. We have to go back to the drawing board and to think, where do our alliances actually lie? I have been traveling extensively in the Southern Hemisphere in the last few years, and I was astounded to discover two things. Whether in Kenya or in South Africa or in Chile or Brazil or in New Zealand or many other places, how much traction did our cause actually have within these countries? And the intellectual and that generation of intellectuals in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that formulated political thoughts around their solidarity and support of Palestine. That's one realization. And the other realization of how the whole thing is just falling apart at the seams. How Israel is now regaining and building a threshold in Africa, and how the Palestinian narrative is being slowly removed and marginalized from the intellectual thoughts in these societies. Who's responsible for that? And how are we going to rectify this situation? So number one, we need to move away from Washington altogether. And we need to stop begging for money and charity and, perhaps a change of mind on the part of, former colonial and neo-colonial Western powers, and to start rediscovering our strategic depth in the Southern Hemisphere and work with minority groups subjugated, discriminated against groups within Western societies, because we have so many allies that we just need to go and make a case, our case made clear to them, and champion their causes as well. Intersectionality should not be an academic phrase or term. Intersectionality should be practiced on a daily basis as far as the many struggles around the world are concerned. And we have seen a great deal of success for the Palestinian movement in the United States when they really worked closely with the Black Lives Matter, and we see this happening in other parts of the world. I think this is the future of Palestine, not neglecting and turning our backs on the Middle East. This is our history, this is our region, these are our roots. We have to work very closely with Middle Eastern, Arab, and Muslim countries, but we have to break free as well from the confines of nationalism and regionalism into a global audience and explore every opportunity in order for us to ultimately be able to translate that and merge that within a larger centralized political strategy that will ultimately, hopefully, lead to the final liberation of Palestine in whichever political form the Palestinian people agree that is the form to fight for.
Thank you, Ramzy. We've had a few questions from the audience, and I'd like to start with one about that touches upon a couple of comments that you both mentioned in your interventions regarding the question of leadership in particular. And of course, as you know, a lot of the debate around Palestine often sort of goes in the direction of talking about representation, into Palestinian politics. What is the role of, say, the Palestinian Authority, and does it have to play a role? And if you're talking tactics and strategies, what is the way forward for Palestinians? So if you could perhaps tell us what you think in terms of at least, the next few steps, or, how do we look at the question of representation and leadership within the Palestinian sort of space? What are the key points to be mindful of as we go ahead? And perhaps, Mezna, would you like to go first, or? Okay, maybe Ramzy.
So democracy is a culture, and I know it has been given such a bad name, and understandably so. When the US brought its massive army to Iraq and the rest of the Middle East and tried to impose a very strange, bewildering version of democracy on the Arabs, and of course, democracy had nothing to do with American intentions, and when that failed, and surely it was going to fail, they dubbed the Arabs themselves to be a failure, as in Iraqis are not ready for Scandinavian type democracy, as if the Americans actually entertain any form of Scandinavian democracy, or in fact, of even an actual form of democracy in a functional sense. But that's not the subject. The subject is Palestinians require democracy, but not democracy in the way that is being envisaged by the donors' countries, by those who are sustaining and propping up the Palestinian leadership, by those who are fighting for this kind of maintaining this post-Oslo culture and imposing it on the Palestinian people. Remember, Netanyahu, the former Israeli prime minister, has made an impassioned argument for Palestinian democracy. But in his view, it was Palestinians are not united, and they need to be united in order for us as Israelis to have a partner peace. How do we have a peace partner if Palestinians don't even have elected officials? But of course, Israel would do everything in its power to ensure Palestinians don't even have a nominal degree of democracy whatsoever, and they make it impossible for Palestinian democracy to function under occupation. There are those who expect Palestinian democracy to operate as if some sort of a facade, like an icing on an imaginary cake that doesn't even exist in the first place, in order for Mahmoud Abbas or whomever else to come and say, I am the elected representative or leader of the Palestinian people, and so forth. That's not a democracy that a liberation movement should be aspiring to achieve. And let's be very clear. There are numerous expressions of Palestinian democracy that have been in existence for many years. My latest book, not the forthcoming one, my last one of a year or so ago, was about Palestinian prisoners. These chains would be broken. And I was really impressed, and in fact humbled, by how these prisoners, regardless of whatever faction or movement they belonged to, always made sure that they actually vote in prison. Even when the Israeli prison guards makes it nearly impossible for them to operate, how they would even tap at the walls of their prison cells to communicate their vote and to choose their representatives who would bargain or negotiate on their behalf with the Israeli prison administration. You see expressions of Palestinian democracies in many civil society organizations. You see it in Palestinian University, where democracy has really thrived for decades. So I don't think we have a crisis in democracy within Palestinian society. we have a misuse of democracy in Palestinian society. The focus should be on dialogue and ensuring under these horrific situations that Palestinians have people who are as representative of the Palestinian people as possible. We cannot, under these circumstances, and I really can't think of a single national liberation movement that held general elections under military occupation and colonialism to elect its leaders. It's just unheard of. So I think we need to abandon this old illusion that democracy is possible under military occupation and think of democracy as a culture of dialogue, a culture of acceptance, and whenever possible, negotiate little spaces for ourselves in order for us to express and negotiate small rooms and margins to express our democratic culture, which, as I said, has been manifesting itself in so many different ways and for many years.
Thank you, Ramzy. Before I ask Mezna to answer the question on leadership and the question of representation, we've had a question that sort of ties into this by Abdurrahim. And what, the question, I mean, it's a three-part question, but the part that is most relevant to this is, he says, relying on historical experience, does the struggle of representing Palestinians promote or hamper Palestinian interests? Which I think Ramzy was saying, I think suggesting that it was hampering, if anything, to have the struggle of the question of representation. So maybe you could take it from here, Mezna, in terms of what you think, how we should approach the question of representation / leadership.
So I'd like to kind of expand a little bit to say that I'm less interested in democracy as a kind of electoral project, right, of elections and voting and that sort of thing. And democracy written much larger, maybe around questions of representation, but really around ways of collective life and study and the ways people talk to each other and build relationships of differing opinions that yet work together historically. And I think about that through questions of popular sovereignty rather than state sovereignty, rather than territorial sovereignty. And by popular sovereignty, I mean a sovereignty that is articulated in the way people relate to each other, we, rather than me and you, right? And that we has to be built, and it has to constantly be worked on. And I think that there's no way around that. I think what tends to happen is when people are not able to ingather, to discuss together and determine together, you immediately lose legitimacy, mechanisms of accountability, and you're captured. You're captured by capital, by other states, by empire, by a constellation of those things. And I think that that's a lesson we can draw from any anti-colonial movement and nationalist movement around the world, and certainly in the global South. So that's where I'm thinking and I'm concerned about when it comes to this question of representation. And I think also, some Palestinians have had the opportunity to vote, but the vast majority of Palestinians never could. The Palestinians of the diaspora, the Shatat, which are more than half. The Palestinians of Chile and Latin America in general, when did they ever get asked what they think the solution should be to Palestine? The Palestinians in the US, the Palestinians in the UK, in Kuwait, anywhere. That has dominated Palestinian politics for a long time. It was certainly abandoned in Oslo. I would probably date it to actually much earlier than Oslo, this kind of fissure between those inside and democracy inside rather than, and an exclusion of the broader Palestinian national body politic outside, to 1974. the minute Arafat showed up to Geneva and triggered a different way of thinking about the Palestinian struggle, then a whole set of other things emerged, like statism, like the idea of territorial Palestine and an exclusion of those outside of it from political decision-making, et cetera, et cetera. Certainly, there was always an inside and an outside dynamic, but that eventually then collapses in under Oslo, and on and on. So those are some of to answer Abdurrahim's question, those are some of the sets of questions that we have to ask ourselves. Is how does a national movement make decisions? And how can we bring as many Palestinians from everywhere into these conversations and deliberations? That's where the problem of representation comes from. It's who we listen to and who we can listen to. Who's missing from the table? The mechanisms, the engine, the machine that allows for such a thing to happen can be talked about and discussed. But the point is to try to actually figure out how we hear everybody, or as many as we can, and bring all their interests onto the table. So I hope that clarifies that.
It does. That's an extremely thought-provoking answer, and I think for me, if you remember before we started the session, I said one of the key aims would be to come up with new questions and try and sort of refine what the key questions people should be asking and wondering about would be. And I think that there's been a lot of that in this discussion, and our time is almost up. And I'm mindful of the fact that this is going to be hopefully a fairly long series of events, and there's so many dimensions that have been sort of invoked in this session. And I think the role of the intellectual, which was highlighted at the very start of the session, is something that is definitely worth revisiting. And there's so many other, the role of class, the importance of representation, as Mezna said in her last answer. I suppose the best way to maybe conclude is to ask you guys to give us maybe some, by way of closing remarks, what you think a young activist trying to think of how to where to go from here. They've seen what happened in the last few months. They're trying to figure out how they can channel their energies, what battles to take part in, what particular sort of axes of resistance to join. Maybe not a phrase, but yeah, you understand what I mean. But yeah, just if you can, by way of closing remarks, just have some sort of a letter to a young activist sort of style answer. Maybe Ramzy could go first.
Absolutely. I just very quickly want to say that I'm very grateful for this discussion and an honor to be included with Mezna and you, Hisham, in this. I remember during the Iraq War that Noam Chomsky was asked what should Americans do about what their country is doing in the Middle East, and his answer was, well, in certain parts of the world, people don't ask what to do; they just do it. And I think really that is kind of simple answer, but in a way, it's also so true that if you know your position, your moral position regarding any issue, and you are comfortable with that moral position, then just do it. Engage, get involved, agitate, be part of the conversation. Don't allow anyone to speak down to you. Don't allow anyone to speak on your behalf. If you are a Palestinian, take a center stage and speak to other fellow Palestinians anywhere in the world. Let's try to formulate at least a unity of narrative in order for us to push for that unified narrative and assert it as the Palestinian discourse that is going to challenge and eventually vanquish the dominant Zionist discourse that has controlled much of the global awareness on Palestine for many years. I remember, I think it was Frantz Fanon who said that every generation has a mission in life. I'm paraphrasing, of course, has a mission in this life. It's either to betray it or fulfill it. And I say to people, especially those who are mobilizing around Palestine, care for Palestine, and they understand the centrality of the Palestinian question within the larger question of global justice, is do not betray that mission, engage and fulfill that mission. That is the least we can do, considering the Israeli oppression of Palestinians, the colonization, racism, violence, and apartheid that has lasted for several generations. This will only end if we decide to make the right choice to engage and embrace that mission.
Thank you, Ramzy. Yeah, Mezna, go ahead.
So there's not much more I can add to that, right? To get involved wherever you can, in whatever way you can, with whatever, resources you have. To, Palestine requires you to be a little fearless. We think that the discourse has shifted. I don't think it's shifted as much as we think it has. I think that we're in the midst of a backlash, but that backlash should just make us, find those who spoke up and protect each other, and work together. I think it's also important to, in the moment now and in the future, to understand that Palestine is a long struggle and it's a long fight. And if you get tired, it's okay. Others will take up the work, and that's what it requires. Nobody needs to be a hero by themselves. It's collective. It's not just collective in its goals, but it's collective in its work. And I think it's also really important to remember that Palestine is also, and most importantly, a promise that there are people in the world who are still demanding freedom, still finding ways to struggle for freedom and for liberation, not only for themselves, but for everyone around them and for others, and for everyone's freedom and liberation. So to feel that you are part, when you're struggling for Palestine, or you're fighting or speaking up, or you're saying anything for Palestine, that it's for you too, and for your community, and for whatever struggle you're also part of. It is anti-capitalist. It is anti-racist. It is anti-imperialist. It is against war. It is against climate change, and for a tomorrow where we all actually survive. All of those things have Palestine written in them. You can be part of all those movements and just bring Palestine in. Please do, be involved in the anti-militarist movement, be involved in climate change activism, and bring Palestine in. Palestine's everywhere. Understand that and feel that in a good way, because it is a struggle for freedom like any other struggle, and it's in a communion with those struggles too. Thank you.